Welcome to The Curious Developer. I'm Jesper Peterson from KDAB, and in this episode, I brought in nobody less than Mr. Kalle Dalheimer, my boss, that's why I'm so polite, to tell us a bit about the user experience in using AI tools for development. Welcome to the channel, Kalle.
Thanks, Jesper, and thank you for having me. And I'm both surprised and flattered that you're calling on a suit to explain how to actually get stuff done using AI tools.
Okay, Kalle, you have been a first mover in many things. Qt were one of those things, like, 30 years ago by now, or 25 or something like that. And then came the revolution of AI, and people started talking about AI. A lot of people was just shrugging and saying, well, I have my code completion in my favorite IDE, and that works fine for me, so why would I even want to do that? But you were unstoppable. You were, before most of us, actually trying AI development, but not on your usual Qt projects that you know so well how to develop, but on something completely new. I'd like to hear your experience from using AI to develop software.
Yes, so I follow industry news, and I started reading about a variety of AI tools, and that got me curious. Maybe a little background is obviously I'm running a company that has grown to a decent size. So that means I spend most of my waking time actually running and managing this company. So I don't get much time anymore for what I originally wanted to do, which was write software. I have lots and lots of ideas of software that I want to see written and that I would want to write myself. But I realized that both my skills were slowly sliding backwards for lack of training. I did the Carter thing, sort of doing small programming tasks to sort of keep things in my fingers and in my brain, but still that's not comparable to getting something actually done where so much more than actually writing the code is involved, like version control and CI it had come to the point where I felt I will never be able to do that again, save possibly in retirement, and then I would have to relearn everything. Yeah. So when I heard about these tools, I was curious, of course. I did not really have specific expectations, but I started using a few of them on a couple of project ideas that I've had for some of them for many, many years. And it turns out that they got me over many of the initial hurdles where for lack of time and also lack of updated skills, I never thought I would get over. And that's things like project scaffolding. Running CI elsewhere than on my own computer was something new for me that I hadn't done before. And so setting all these things up that would have amounted to many, many hours that I would never have had, certainly not consecutively. And it turned out that some of these tools, especially when they started to introduce the so-called agent modes, were able to set up many things for me. And then after I had something working, that again provided an excellent learning point for me to see, okay, what did the tool just set up? So now I have integration tests here. So how did it do that? How are they working? I'm running CI on GitHub. How is that actually working? What kind of code or configuration files did it work for me? So I was able to learn not from contrived examples from a book or from a tutorial, but from actually my running project or project under development.
So, as the viewer might already know, I have a 13-year-old here at home that is interested in programming, and she doesn't have much experience at all. She has done an internship with us for 3 days. That's her amount of programming experience. Would you say that she can just jump in and start talking to an AI and it will do the coding and she can learn from it? Or how do you see that?
She can probably jump in. The question is whether she will be very successful or even just satisfied with that. Because one of the problems with all these tools is at some point they will fail. They get better and better, but that just means the point of failure gets pushed out a little bit further with every release. But they will still fail at some point. And then if you don't understand what you got and you don't have I mean, I could draw back on, I actually did the math this morning, on no less than 40 years of software development experience. So even if I tried something in a programming language that was new or fairly new to me, or I was using tools that were new to me, I could still relate to things I had done previously. If you're very new to programming, then and just trying to get your feet wet and learn how things work, then I would probably think these tools are more of a roadblock for you, actually, because you also need to learn how to use them. And in particular, you will run into problems, and then you won't be able to fix them, and that will just get you frustrated. So it's better to get frustrated over code that you've actually handwritten yourself, because then you knew what you did.
And it's not like it's anything new that you couldn't ask the internet for help. I mean, back in, well, not our early days, but mid-days at least, we were Googling things to figure out what did this error message mean. Now it's just a different API in asking ChatGPT, what does this error message mean? But so what you're saying really is that stuff like, that there is a concept like a class that can be a container of stuff, and you can instantiate the class to get numerous items out of that container of things. And there is stuff like a vector or whatever the new programming language is called, and there's loops and whatnot. That is the steps forward that she might be missing.
Yes, you need to understand the general concepts like loops and branch statements and object orientation and possibly some functional programming. Because if you don't have that, then the tool will just generate code for you, and that code will be no different than code that you've downloaded somewhere from the internet, because you won't understand what you're actually looking at.
The way I see these tools, and Jan demonstrated adding a member variable to a struct that was fetched on the QML side of things, and it did all of these things. So the way I see it is that it's a great tool for the more mundane, boring tasks, but it's not going to replace your work entirely, at least not in our lifetime, simply because that there's too much abstraction going on, too much basic knowledge and understanding what does the user want and so on.
I would be careful with saying in our lifetime these days, because I have if I have average life expectancy, I have about 30 years left to go. And in these 30 years, so much can happen.
Okay, fair point.
If we restrict ourselves to the next 2, 3, 4 years, then yes, that's correct. But there's another aspect. You spoke about adding an instance variable for something, and when I was still spending most of my waking hours writing code, obviously I knew in and out and how to do that. And we had already 25 years ago, we had Emacs macros that did some of the rote tasks of programming for us. Like, for example, we could have, if we take an example from C++, we could write a method declaration in a header file, and then we could just hit a function key that would run a macro that would generate a stubbed out implementation in the implementation file. So that we had 25 years ago. Let's say I have some code that accesses a database and that stores some entities in the database. And now I can say, dear model, please look at the code that I've already written for storing appointments in the database, and write code that does the same for, I don't know, notifications, alarms, for example. And then it will do a lot of these rote tasks. And again, if you're doing this every day, then you might almost be just as fast. I was actually using this to learn programming languages I was only vaguely familiar with previously. Then you don't have this in your fingers, and it can be quite frustrating to have to look up syntactic features of a new programming language, or even, so what was that method called again that opens the database access? And if these things that they don't generate a lot of conceptual learning for you if you do them manually. Obviously, you still learn how to do these things tactically in your fingers, but you don't, especially if you're adding the fifth entity to a database that already has 4 different ones, then the learning effect of writing that code will be very small. And then I might just as well have an AI do it for me.
Fair enough. And I learned from Jan in the previous interviews, please do not be polite to your AI, because it's cost a lot of tokens for the AI to pass. What does a dear model mean?
That's actually quite interesting. So I think he referred to a recent interview with Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, who was asked, so how does it affect you? And he said, and I don't think it's known, or it's quite sure whether he was joking or not, but he said it costs us tens of millions of dollars. He didn't specify in which time, and obviously for the billions that OpenAI spends, tens of millions of dollars is actually not a whole lot of money. But so yes, obviously more words. The AI will have to read these words and tokenize them and understand them. On the other hand, there is research that says that you actually get better answers from your large language models if you're polite with them. And I find this interesting. And so I've thought about this, and sort of my non-scientific explanation for this is that a lot of the knowledge that is instilled into the weights of the models, they come out of public fora, they come out of Reddit, they come out of Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
Especially in the context of programming, would be similar ones in other contexts. And I mean, how do you, leaving aside all AI, if you post a question on such a forum, what would you do in order to increase your chances to get a good answer? You would be polite. You would be dereferential, because you want somebody else to spend their time to give you a useful answer. So I would not be surprised if it actually turns out that the good answers in these forums, they are answers to questions that were asked politely. So this is my explanation. Again, this is I'm just guessing here, but it's good. It's a good enough working hypothesis for myself.
So the best way of getting something done is flattery. So just dear AI, you that knows this much, can you please tell me how do I write a destructor in C++? See if that gets you a better answer.
It's possible if that is, and that again, that would be an interesting question for research. If it turns out that gets you better answers on Stack Overflow, then that would also be what got the models better input from Stack Overflow. So that's possible. I'm not going to that extent. I'm just saying, I actually say, please, what I don't do, and I think that is what Sam Altman referred to, after I got an answer from a model, I won't type thank you and nothing else. I might then, if I then want to give the model the next task, or if I want to continue that, then I might say thank you, and now let's work on this other class. And I've actually once or twice I've caught myself writing, thank you, this was great, let's work on this other class now. That was probably not useful, but again,
and I guess
why should I? It just makes things more difficult for me if I behave differently towards the model and towards the humans I communicate with.
And I guess if you're truly worried about token counts, then maybe ask your model to not be congratulating you on, that's a really great question you have there. I would like to think deep about that and then give you an answer if that's okay. It's like these very chatty models can sometimes like, dude, I know you're a computer. Stop doing that.
Yeah, some, especially the sort of the newer thinking, so-called thinking models, yes, who explain their thinking process, which, by the way, I find quite fascinating.
It is.
It is, in particular, if you think how is this thinking? It's just inference on a neural network. But then again, what is human thinking? That's also just inference on a neural network. So if we use I've actually come to the conclusion to myself that it's not weird to use the term thinking for a deep inference on a neural network, but that's a decision that everybody needs to make for themselves.
Okay, very interesting stuff there. We got slightly off topic from what we started out with, but that's cool. Any final thoughts or remarks on the process of using AI in development?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is don't expect that you can just pull something out of your AI programming tool and deploy it. Do not make the AI write something for you that you wouldn't have been able to write yourself with a lot more effort, with a lot more time, or that at least theoretically you would have been able to write yourself. As I said, in my case, I just don't have the time slots available for that, especially not for pet projects, for hobby projects. But if you let an AI tool write code for you that you don't understand, then sooner or later you'll run into a roadblock. The generated code will be wrong, and you will have no idea what you're actually looking at, and that obviously creates a lot of frustration. So use it as, just like many other tools that programmers have available, use it as a tool. Don't use it to replace your understanding of what you're doing.
And I can, from personal experience, tell you there's nothing more embarrassing than putting some code up for review and then somebody's asking, why did you do that? It's like, oh, yeah, I should likely have reviewed the code myself a bit better that I got out of my chatbot here.
But that's actually code review. That's a good topic. So I've made a change, and then I wish I would be pair programming right now, but I don't have anybody to pair program with. So I have occasionally sent a patch to AI tool and asked it, so in the context of this is the code base, can you please comment this? And sometimes I get useful answers, sometimes I don't, but in either way, it's a second round of thinking of my own patch, and that must always be a good thing.
That's actually an interesting point there. Every time I do some development, I always do a full review of my own code before I set it up for review. Sometimes, of course, something will slip through, but maybe there should be that extra step in there. Review myself, send for review with an AI, and then send for review with my costly coworkers who needs to think careful and who is annoyed every time they see some code that I should have thought myself. I mean, I way too often I get just the word explicit back in a review. Whenever I created a class with a constructor taking one argument and I forget to add the word explicit because somehow that doesn't make it into my finger muscles, and then I get that back. It's like, not again. That's embarrassing. But yeah.
And I think this could be explicitly valuable in the context of open source projects, where the bottleneck often is reviewing patches, because the maintainers or the main authors, they are very busy people. This might just be their hobby project, or even if it's a full-time project, people who know a lot of stuff tend to be very busy people because they get assigned more work. And so even if there are other contributors and they provide patches, they send merge requests, but then they get stuck in a long merge request pipeline, which frustrates the contributors, of course, because they don't see their code making it into the upstream. So if there's a way of reducing the burden on the reviewers, on the maintainers of, in particular, open source projects, or rather, it's not so much about the license, but about hobbyist projects that people don't get paid for, then that cannot be a bad thing. That would certainly be a good thing.
That seems to be a very wise word to end this interview with. Thank you very much for taking the time, Kalle.
Thank you.